good to take back to your chapter, as well as the resources. I would by no means claim to be an expert in this area, but this book was the first thing that kind of sparked my interest, and these are authors created the IAT, which is the implicit association test, and that is what you all did before coming to this session. So our objectives for today, this is a very entry-level type of session about this topic. It's hard to go really in depth for the first time that you're talking with a group of people and when you only have the hour time limit. So this is what we're trying to do today. Understand the concept, recognize that everyone has implicit bias, and recognize some ways that it might present itself in our sorority experience. Sorry, I do have to drink water when I'm talking, as most people, but my mouth dries out very quickly. So what is implicit bias? We're just going to jump right in and post a definition and then have our first discussion question. Implicit bias refers to the brain's automatic instant association of stereotypes or attitudes towards particular groups without our conscious awareness. So that's just the definition right there. For the purposes of this virtual convention, I have asked you all to take the IAT in advance. So again, we'll get more into that, but just if you haven't, don't worry and take it later because it's good. So our first discussion question is 2 parts. Again, feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself or type anything into the chat for Allison to speak out. But what does this definition mean to you? Do you have any questions or thoughts about the definition? I'm just kidding. I'm not going to sing for y'all.
I can go. I guess for me, it's like bringing together all of your background experiences, but maybe not always thinking about how they affect what you do in daily life. So I'm very conscious of the fact that I spell things in a different way to other people, but I might not be conscious of how my upbringing affects my decision making.
Yeah, so some of that lived experience that I talked about really quickly at the beginning. Thank you, Shruti. The IATs, like I said, that stands for Implicit Association Test, and that was the pre-session homework. The last times that I presented this, I had more time, so I actually did a pseudo IAT on the screen with the original flower and bug concept. So, excuse me. The first IAT was called the flower IAT. And so in the flower IAT, similar to the activity you did, where it was left is these 2 categories, right is these 2 categories, and it changes up the instructions every time. The flower one didn't have the pictures. It just had flowers and generally positive words such as joy or fun or happiness. And then it had insects like spider and bug and beetle. I don't know. I don't like bugs. But and then it had bad words like disappointment, sadness, grief, loss. So that was the original IAT. And from that, they developed the race IAT, which is the one that I had you all take on the website before this session. And again, with the flowers and the bugs and the words, sometimes it paired flowers and bad words. Sometimes it paired bugs and bad words. But what we found out, and I won't ask you all to share your results. That's a very personal thing that I would never ask a group of people to do. But what's going on during these IATs is that the brain forms associations in a certain way. I just said to you, I don't like bugs. So when I was doing the flower IAT, it was much easier for me when the instructions paired, okay, the bugs and the bad words are this side, and the flowers and the good words are this side, because instead of remembering 4 categories, my brain automatically said, oh, there's 2 categories, good and not good. right? So it's flowers and good words or happy words are just, that's the good side, and the bugs are the bad side. So that mental glue means that those two categories share emotional value. And so your brain is going to stick them together. That glue is called mental association. If you're into the science side of things, I'm not a very scientific person, but I think it's important to know, if I'm going to talk about some of these things our brain is doing, I want to have at least that base understanding. So with the mental association, that's what I described, is that for most people, the flowers and the pleasant words are easier in that activity because of the mental association that they share. You can just have two categories instead of the four. So that's just the IATs explained. They started with that flower and bug one, but then they moved on to the race IAT, and we'll dive into that one a little bit more as well. This may not be fair, but what my next discussion question, if you did look at the website, just think back to what other options there were besides race, and that what other IATs, implicit association tests, might be useful in today's society.
Age and gender.
Okay.
There's a question, was income one of the options?
This is just a discussion, so yes, it can be.
Weight.
Wait.
Gender, weapon, sexuality.
If anyone has the website pulled up right now, that's cheating, but I will allow it.
Religion, education, political bias.
Yeah.
And more.
And more. Yeah, so all of the things that you said are correct. I'm not the inventor of the IAT test, so if something that we mentioned would be useful but that doesn't exist yet, then hopefully it's something that comes out in the future. But all of these listed on the slide, and even more that you might have mentioned, are available IAT. So if you go back to that website, implicit.harvard.edu, you can take the gender career IAT, you can take the disability IAT, all of these and more. So thank you all who responded in the chat. I will see them all at the end. So now let's get into some more of the meat of why I had to take the race IAT, which tends to reveal what the authors of that book and the creators of the tests call an automatic white preference. So about half of the people who take this test, the researchers themselves included, and myself included, obtain a result that deviates from their original expectation. So when these researchers were just starting, they would walk up to people and verbally say, hey, Allison, do you have a preference for white people over people of color? And Allison says, no, of course not. I don't treat people differently.
Word for word, spot on.
100%, because that's not a thing that people often say in any type of official capacity. No, I do actually differentiate how I treat folks based on what they look like. But the reality is that almost 75% of people who take this race IAT in the online, and they used to have some in-person groups as well, so a cumulative almost 75% do reveal at least a moderate automatic white preference. And I asked this question. I had the pleasure of seeing one of the authors present in person. And so I said, does that include not white folks? Does that include people of color? And they said, yes, not every, it's not 100% of people, right? But almost 75% of people who take this test, including people of color, have some level of automatic white preference. And so preference is usually rated as moderate or slight There's like a lot of science behind this, and I don't go into that for the purpose of this session, but there's a numeric score behind whatever your result was, what if it was slight, if it was no preference, or high or whatever. And so if your score is above certain numbers, that's where the breaking points are for slight, moderate, or high automatic white preference. But if your score is below a certain number, then it is too statistically insignificant to indicate a preference. Those words are hard for me to say in a row. So statistically insignificant to indicate a preference. So we'll talk a little bit more about white preference, but I think there's another discussion question. Yes. What are some examples that you can think of where white preference is displayed, perpetuated, and or glorified in today's society?
I have one.
Mhm.
Recently this semester, I took a class called Globalizing Africa. We talked about how like over the years, like the different aspects, like economically and like culturally, how it changed in the past like 50 years or past 100 years. And one section we talked about was like one of the articles we read is about like how people would buy like whiteners or like skin whiteners in order to look like have their skin lighter. And then other people in our class talked about how it not only occurs in Africa, but also in other places like Asia and even here in America, where people buy skin bleachers in order to appear lighter.
Wow, thank you for sharing that.
Typical beauty standards that white women are more beautiful than women of color is another example. All over the media, our politicians are mostly white. Most influencers and famous people are white.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, may I speak on one?
Yeah.
I would say like education, like a lot of just history in general, like history books, like a lot of it just only talks about the white side of history rather than all of it.
Yeah, a lot of education is white focused. Mm-hmm.
And there are a few more examples. So we have the judicial system tends to favor white people over Black people. In curricula, music composers, essays read, books included are usually from predominantly white people. And also the trend of straightening hair to look more like white hair.
Right. Thank you all. Those are great examples. I have a couple of minimal things listed. I saw one more pop up. Was that about this, Allison?
Pop culture tends to whitewash a lot.
Right. Yeah. So some of the things that I listed here were the movies and TV. Like we said, a lot of mainstream famous folks are white folks. A lot of the mainstream movies are primarily white actors and actresses. The news and to some extent personal stories. A couple of you just shared personal stories, and like often people might have those personal stories as well. And more, like you all just listed more than what was on this slide, and that's great because that is the purpose of the discussion. So I appreciate all of you sharing. Okay. So, nope, not yet. Sorry. It is worth mentioning that automatic white preference has been shown statistically to predict discriminatory behavior. Now, when folks hear the word discrimination or discriminatory behavior, oftentimes our minds jump to the worst of the worst. But those are not the only types of discriminatory behavior that exists. So, for this, I like to talk more about some nonverbals and things that people do that are much more subtle than where your mind jumps to initially when you hear discrimination. So that might be just your nonverbals when interacting with a person. Are you crossing your arms with a person of color, but they're open and down with a white person? How people talk to each other. And there's also data to indicate that white job applicants are judged more favorably than equally qualified Black applicants. in addition to ER doctors recommending optimal treatments less often for a Black patient than for a white patient. So, you know, these are not like people out in the streets like saying, you know, I don't like this or like I don't like that type of person, but they're real world problems that have real world impacts for our friends, for our you know, our colleagues, for us as humans. And it's important for folks that do have the white privilege in our existence to recognize these biases and the potential acts of discrimination and stand up for people when we can. Because, you know, if you think about ER doctors not recommending an optimal treatment simply based on someone's skin color, like that's not right and that's not fair. So we want to be more just and more aware as like a society than that. So again, going back to the researchers' original, if you ask these people if they're doing that, like they're going to say no. The qualitative data does not reflect the actual facts, you know, and this was all determined, again, science. They did mock interviews on a video, and then it was analyzed by like body, what's the word? Like nonverbal expert people. And, you know, so that's how they figured out the one about the job applicants. I don't remember how they did the ER doctors, but it was in that book from the beginning where they go into a little bit more detail. And there is statistical information to indicate that this stuff is happening in the real world. So now we'll have some more discussion. Does preference, like the automatic white preference, mean prejudice or racism, or like what are your thoughts on that and what's the difference? There's not really a wrong answer, if that makes anyone feel better, but.
To me, I think preference is different from prejudice, because in preference, like you said before, like it's automatic and sometimes we don't even notice or catch what we're doing. Whereas in most of the times for like prejudice and racist acts, those people are like explicitly going out and doing it, and like they know exactly what they're doing and they know why they're doing it. Or rather than preference, it's like we might be doing it on accident because we never knew it was wrong, or that was just the norm when we grew up.
Yeah, thank you. So you're saying like preference is more of having this awareness, like knowing, like I introduced in the topic of implicit bias and being aware, but the prejudice is when that preference is turned into action.
Yes, like I think prejudice is more consciously aware, whereas preference is like more unconsciously not aware.
Right. Thank you.
And I think that's backed up with one of the comments. It says, I think preference is how you think and prejudice is how you then act. So that ties together. There's another comment that says, I'm not sure if it means any of those things. I think those things are determined by one's intentions or actions. So I think that those are all along the similar vein. And then Christopher, he's fine, I'm sure, with me saying his name, just happened automatically. In graduate school, he learned about how pain is differently accepted based on who is complaining of pain. And data shows that providers believe that people of color have higher pain tolerances. And I've also learned that in graduate school.
Going back to some of that ER doctor discussion too.
Yeah.
May I chime into the discussion?
Yes, please.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So I feel like some people try to they fuel their preference with their prejudice, if that makes sense. Like, for example, like let's say some people say, oh, I only date Black girls or I only date white girls, and they'll say, oh, that's just my preference. However, they're kind of like disguising their preference with the prejudice.
Okay, interesting take. Thank you.
In my frame of thought, I am a person of mixed race. So my mother is white and my father is African American. I see these things coming from both sides. You know, there's always the argument from people in my childhood. It's not so bad now once people mature, but you know, if someone maybe has like a less mature mindset, like in primary or secondary school, or if they just don't have a good grasp on that, you know, I get the thing like, oh, you're not white enough, or you're not black enough, or you act a certain color. I don't think that, we act a color. So I feel like there shouldn't really be a place for prejudice, because prejudice is fueled by the backing of you act a certain way if you are this or that. You know what I mean? I feel like we're all just people. We all act differently no matter what. The inherent bias of prejudice would be that, people of a certain race or ethnicity act a certain way, and I don't think that we should really have that viewpoint when it comes to people. But of course, it's going to happen because we're all people and we all think differently.
Yeah, thank you for sharing a more personal example. I appreciate that. Yeah, thank you all for sharing. In general, I don't think there's a right or a wrong answer or way to think about this. The book, which, like I said, is the basis for the presentation, does kind of mention, and in the objectives, it was to recognize that implicit bias is almost unavoidable because we're surrounded by all this information from the media, from the news, from whatever. But it kind of backs up what y'all were saying, where the prejudice or explicit racism is where that turns to, from just becoming aware of it and then also acting upon that bias that you have. So having the implicit bias is not necessarily bad because it's considered unavoidable in our society as it is right now. But acting, once you recognize it, you have to take some steps, which we'll go over in the resources section. Like, ideally, we want you to take some steps to reduce your bias and to lessen the negative impact that you might have on folks around you. The next discussion question is, what other implicit biases might you and others have that are not race related?
Here at my college, I'm sorry I'm talking a lot, but I just have an opinion.
I love it. Don't worry.
There are a few individuals, not in my chapter, because I feel like, yeah, Amina, I agree. I was about to say that. Ooh, girl. Not in my chapter so much because, inherently, I feel like some of my, like, women in general tend to have a broader outlook because they are one of those marginalized groups in some terms of sexism. But our side chapter at my school, there are a few people that are very, like, defensive about women joining their chapter, and then when they do the specific thing they do in the chapter, like, there's the power struggle of the over masculine man. That's a whole different discussion. But one of the biases I see with some people in our side chapter is that, a girl wants to join and they put them through the ringer extra hard than a guy, because they're like, yeah, can you hold your own? Can you do all this physical labor that we have to do inside or whatever they do? And I just think that shouldn't be a thing. If they want to be inside because they like the organization better, or they want to be part of serving the band in the way that side does, I don't think there should be that, thing going on where, oh, a woman shouldn't be in our chapter, this, that.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing and putting the spin of the organizational context into it. And that's something that I'm not going to speak for like every chapter, but I will say that just in my personal experience, there seems to be drastically different situations at schools based on physical locations. So like some districts, it's just regionally, they have more of those types of hard divides, whereas like in other districts they're like, nope, we have tons of girls inside, we have tons of guys, and Sigma Sigma, like it's much more, and it has been more fluid for a long time. And I think in other locations, folks are still getting used to the idea of a female, sister, or a male sister or a female brother. And we as an organization are also working on our language and stuff like that throughout, which has been really cool to watch as well.
Some other responses we have are sexuality, gender identity, and disabilities.
Yes. Fair. This question is very similar to the what other IATs should exist, but it's a different way of framing it. So what types of biases might we have against, weight, and the things you just listed, Allison, some notes that I made for myself for this question were, again, gender, career, disability, which was mentioned. Gender science was one specific one because I work at MIT. I brought this up when I presented that. There is that science is still very much a male dominated field, and there can be a lot of negative experiences for women trying to work in that field, and particularly even more so women of color. It's like just stacking, cards against the deck at that point. Age can be one, sexuality, weight, skin tone, and religion. So, excellent. Are there any other comments right now, Allison?
That's the list for right now.
Okay. Thank you all so much for sharing. I really appreciate it. I knew I was a little bit nervous about this being a virtual session. It's a little bit harder to have discussion-based workshops, but I appreciate all of your input so far today. So thank you. Now we'll get into I wasn't sure if this will be joint or not, and then I guess I forgot to update this slide. So here we are. Here's something that by the end of it, there's going to be 3 separate blocks. Feel free to take a picture if you do want to take this back to your chapter. Oh man, I thought they show up one at a time, but we'll just do it one at a time. I promise I know how to work a computer, but I don't know what's happening to me today. So the first question is, are there processes that can be improved to reduce the impact of implicit bias? And this question comes from the idea that, one, we want to recognize that the implicit bias exists, but it's very, 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 very hard to completely eliminate it. And it's very, very, very hard to change someone else's mind. If you're in a discussion, like you might be able to influence them, but the focus on these questions moving forward is going to be about processes to work to make them more fair and equitable, because we are humans and we are flawed, but we can make processes a lot better than we can change people's minds. So sorry, I kind of like tangented, but the first question is, are there processes within your chapter that can be improved to reduce the impact of implicit biases? Feel free to share now, and if not, I think that's a great question to go back and talk with chapters and execs about.
I guess one thing is, I'm thinking about like the beginning of next year a lot, and like leadership styles from this morning and things like that. But I guess for me, it's one thing is just recognizing that implicit biases exist and like what they are. I think like in our chapter, we never really talked about stuff like race, and I think it's just like, it's either something that's never come up or it's never become an issue. But I think that, both within the chapter and outside of the chapter and the processes, it's like good to recognize that those are things that exist in the real world. So I think at the very least, it's just kind of talking about implicit biases. And if it doesn't do anything, at least what it does do is lets people know that they should maybe be conscious of what they're doing.
Yeah, thank you. And that ties into kind of the first 1 and 2 objectives. Like I said, today is very much an overview, but our objectives are to understand the concept of implicit bias and recognize that folks have implicit biases. So
I have a question, Kat.
Yeah.
Do you think that this concept can also be applied in a much more micro way in thinking of like can you apply it for like section biases, like within the band or in different ensembles too? Like, I know it wouldn't be the same degree. Like, do you think it's translatable?
I personally would say like very, very broadly. Like I know in my experience, there's a lot of chapters where they'll say, oh, Sigma, TB Sigma is like all woodwinds, or like it's the whole flute section and then a couple of other instruments. And while that's not the focus of this workshop, I think that can be, if we're having conversations about processes and recruitment and how to have the most diverse chapter possible, I think that can certainly be a part of it, right? Like we can talk about this type of stuff, but also like, why do we have all the flutes and we have we have one brass instrument? How are we not reaching those folks? Are they just not interested? But to really take a look at the processes and say, well, what can we do different to to have more outreach. I think that is the transferable part, but not so much like the negative kind of impacts of, you know, folks that face real world prejudice and discrimination.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. There's a good handful of comments that popped up.
Cool.
So I'm just going to read it as it is. This is kind of a tangent, but Purdue first-year engineering professors, when assigning groups for projects, never put just one female student in a group with all men. It's always either 0 girls or 2 or more in a group, because studies have shown that a woman who is alone in a group of all men is more likely to be ignored. That's the first one. Then there was a comment about gender bias within sections. So within like a flute section, for example, or within the trumpet section, just expectations or various assumptions about gender being in that section. And there's also I'm going to read it again. Taking identifying information out of the process. So for example, having prospective members write letters as a part of the rush process where their name, sex, etc. isn't included. So you're truly only talking about the content. So that's a suggestion for what can be done in a process. And another one, something that our VPM and corresponding KKSI VPM are collaborating on is having recruitment events that are open to both members. I believe that they are planning events that may be marginalized into traditional gender roles, allowing for both organizations to be involved so that people who are interested feel welcome. I think it's also great because people who are interested within the organization are able to interact with both and see who they relate to more regardless of gender.
Love it. Thank you, Allison, for transcribing the chat.
You are welcome. There's more. I'm just reading so that way I understand flow. There's another example. There's definitely section implicit bias within our TBS and KKSI chapters for woodwind orchestra. Woodwind orchestra, TBS, brass, saxophone, percussionist, KKSI. Now that I look at this may also align with traditional gender makeups of each section.
Yeah, and that specifically is something I saw a lot when I was an active, right? Like a lot of our TBS chapters I would encounter were very female heavy, which also involved very woodwind heavy. And, you know, the converse was true for those Kappa Kappa Psi chapters. Like, you know, they could be very male heavy and then also very brass heavy. So,
right. And there's more discussion about examining service projects to make sure that it doesn't seem like sisters and brothers aren't always doing traditional roles.
Like TBS is mostly women, so they're going to manage the uniforms.
Yeah.
Not that managing uniforms is bad. That is something that I've heard when visiting chapters. So
right.
Uniforms do have to get done.
Right. Another suggestion is the chapter tries to go against the woodwind brass stereotypes by hosting a section of the week where each week our chapter gives snacks to a different section. And that builds different relationships throughout the band then too.
Yeah, love that.
Right. I added in my own comment at the end.
When you're in charge of transcribing the chat, you can do that. Yeah, let's just go ahead and answer any of these questions. I was like, oh, let's do the first one, but since they're all up there, you know, so think about recruitment. We've already had a comment or two about recruitment specifically, as well as new member education. And then like you personally, like what's something that you can change today to be more self-aware or proactive about implicit biases?
One thing my chapter does during recruitment to like maybe minimize the impacts, we try to make sure that most of our chapter shows up because we are a really diverse chapter. We have people that represent the Black community, white community, Asian community, Hispanic community, and male and female. So we have a pretty good mix, which I am very grateful for because we have so many different viewpoints. But we try to make sure as many of us can show up to the events as possible so that people can see themselves in our organization. Because I feel like one of the biggest things that could turn somebody off from an organization is, you know, you walk up to a recruitment event and you see a bunch of people that don't look like you. You know, you can't find yourself in that organization because then it's like, well, maybe they don't let people in that look like me, so why should I try? So that's something our chapter does. Also, we try to be as open as possible. You know, before recruitment events, we talk about how there are things we should maybe filter whenever it comes to things like just being crass or stuff like that. So that's another thing that we do.
Yeah, thank you. It is important, you know, if you think about yourself too, like we're all in the chapters right now, we're in the organizations, but it's hard if you like try, if you're interested, you show up to an event and you're the only person who looks like you know, so that is very welcoming.
Hey, Kat, can I give an example from this is Carrie. I'm one of the colony advisors for the Chicago State University colony for TBS.
Yeah, sure.
And something we talked about, we were going through like who are all the different people in leadership with them and showing them pictures. And it's all females there, and they're all African American. And when we got through looking at the national leadership, and we have Erica and Siobhan, and they were just like blown away. They were all like, this is so awesome that we see people just like us in these positions. And then one of them was even like, my goal in this organization is to get up as high as they are. And it was just really neat, something I would have never thought of because I'm white.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people look like me. So it was just really eye-opening to see that other perspective from them.
Yeah, thank you. And, you know, it can be very powerful to have that experience, to see, like, it makes it feel like you can go above and beyond more things when you have a role model and someone who's done it before. That makes me think about our women in music today who said, you know, it's 2020 and there's been less than 20 female band directors of color in the college world, I think it was. And so, you know, at first it's like you don't see yourself, so you don't know if it's possible, but then she became one and now is like trying to pioneer that and make sure that other, you know, women of color band directors don't have that same challenge of seeing themselves reflected in their profession.
There's a question in the comments.
Okay.
Our chapter tries to be more diverse, but our band in general isn't very diverse in the first place. Does anyone have any ideas to be more inclusive or aware?
Yeah, so folks, feel free to add to that. What comes to my mind is that you can do a lot of things to be more aware, but you can't change the makeup of your band. So, you know, if you take topics like this to heart and try to find, you know, anything that you can implement process-wise, or even just having educational conversations and presentations to the chapter, that will go volumes to the awareness. But, you know, we do have some limitations. I know there's some primarily white institutions where there's just not a lot of diversity in many senses of the word, and you can't change the physical makeup of your band, but there's a lot of work to be done on the awareness front.
So do you have a reason that you can think of that most HBCU chapters are traditionally, like, I've hardly ever seen any Tau Beta Sigma chapter from an HBCU have a male in it, or, you know, vice versa, an HBCU Psi chapter, why aren't there any women in their chapter?
Again, I'm no expert, but in my experience as someone who has not attended a university, I've worked with just a couple of the chapters in my role as a CBA. Sometimes those colleges or universities have some of the gender stereotypes in place. Like culture, it's a cultural kind of a mindset that can be present at the, like I mentioned regionally as well earlier, it can be something similar. And this isn't HBCU specific, but some schools actually have mandated separation like that. It's, in my experience, it's tended to be some of the religiously affiliated schools that say, you know, there can only be women in sororities or men over here. So I have seen that, but that's more broad. And I would love to hear anyone else's perspective as well.
Hey, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, hey everybody, I'm Asha. I'm from the Theta Zeta chapter at NCAT. So I can kind of speak a little bit about the gender representation, like as far as like at HBCU chapters, because my school has a Tau Beta Sigma chapter and a KK Psi chapter. And there have been some talks like within our chapter of speaking with or interfacing with potential candidates that are that identify as males, just because they have either expressed to like someone in the chapter or expressed to someone in the band that they would be interested in Kappa Kappa Psi, but it just doesn't fit like who they are. For them, our Tau Beta Sigma chapter vibe fits them better. But some of the things that we talk about, like within our chapter, are kind of the limitations that we see pushed. We feel like right now it's kind of urged, like if a guy wanted to go through the process of Tau Beta Sigma, that he would kind of be encouraged or pushed more so towards the Kappa Kappa Psi route, and the same vice versa for a female pursuing KK Psi. But one thing I can say about our chapters, both Kappa Kappa Psi and Tau Beta Sigma, although we are both predominantly like black chapters, the gender identity and sexuality representation is pretty I don't want to say versatile, but it's pretty broad, like it's diverse. But those are things that we are actively thinking about. Like now we just finished intake and we're actively thinking about like, okay, we do have a diverse band. Like we have people who identify as Hispanic, Arabic, white, just a little bit of everything. So that's on the race side. And then we also have that same diversity on the gender identity spectrum, which I think personally is really cool. But I do worry sometimes because our chapter is so traditional, like Tau Beta Sigma women, Kappa Kappa Psi men. Where do those people fit in? Like, how can we make our chapter like more inclusive to them? And what we're seeing is we're not seeing like a lot of pushback from like the people in the chapter. That's not really our issue. It's more so from our adult leadership, so our sponsor and advisor and stuff like that. So just kind of educating them, because of course they are older people and the world is changing and stuff like that. So educating them and to get them to understand that, you know, we need to be more inclusive because life is kind of our challenge.
Thank you for sharing. I appreciate that.
And I think there are a few comments that came through that either speak more to like the building awareness, including maybe on the NCAT campus. So some of the examples were being able to travel to other chapters to have those interpersonal relationships, and finding chapters that are more diverse in all the different ways that you can be diverse to work with. Trying to find, doing outreach into your community or neighboring schools that may have just various diversity, collaborating with other organizations on campus. I got to a paragraph one I have to read, I'm sorry.
Can I throw something in while you're reading?
Yeah.
So to talk to Asha or Asha, I don't remember how she pronounced it, I'm sorry. My chapter at my school, we have our Psi and our TBS chapter that were founded around the same time. Or not founded, chartered. Our chapters actually used to be like primarily Black people. You know, there were like maybe one or two in both organizations. There may be one or two white people in the chapters, even though our school is, I don't want to say a PWI because we're pretty well mixed. Even back then, we were pretty well mixed. But our chapters were very like, they were even run a lot like HBCU chapters. So I mean, maybe I can reach out to some of my alumni sisters and, you know, send them your way. Maybe y'all can have some correspondence so y'all can talk about what they did to incorporate, you know, stuff into their chapter. You know, more men and you know what I mean, because they were the chapter was all female. There was like one man in their chapter, while most of the alumni that I know was here. So yeah, maybe if you want to talk to them, friend me on Facebook, and then I can send their information your way, or maybe like add you to a page together and stuff like that.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna find you right now.
Okay.
Allison, if you can read that paragraph now, then I hate to feel like I'm cutting people off, but I want to make sure we go through the resources slides and so that folks can have those resources. And then I have some final takeaways on a slide as well.
Okay, sure. There's 2 comment paragraphs I'm going to read. So the first one is that my school is notorious for not being diverse, and this year our chapter started a program where we focus on a different culture each month, and at the meetings during that month, we try to have a sister that is a part of that culture or someone else to give a little presentation about the culture to help broaden our chapter's understanding of other cultures. That was the first one. Then, in bouncing on the limitations of the environment and a comment that was mentioned before, enabling people to see themselves within your organizations may be helpful. Yes, you may be different in a way such as religion, race, gender. However, finding commonalities and creating good relationships may make your organization more attractive to any person that sees it.
Love it. Thank you all for your comments and for speaking. Like I said, I really appreciate it because this is a discussion-based topic. And for the last question here, like what are some changes for today? I just want to highlight that coming to this session is something. I hope you've enjoyed it, but if you have any questions, comments, feedback, feel free to reach out to me afterwards. And there's other small things that sometimes folks think that can be very helpful. So something I've transitioned from is saying, hey guys, like I used to say, hey guys, which is a very common phrase, but I try to use other words now instead of guys. I say folks a lot. I say friends. I say y'all because I'm from Texas anyway, so why not? So there is small stuff like that that you can do, as well as some of the things that I'll mention in the resources, which are next. So why is it not working? I promise I know how to work computers.
While you're looking at the computer, one of the greetings you can suggest is, hey, all you cool cats and kittens.
I refuse to watch that show. So
I've only watched 2 episodes and that's enough for me, but that was, I'm reading the comment.
Yes. Yeah, no, that is a valid greeting. So here are some resources. Feel free to take a screenshot. One is just the website I've referenced. It has the IATs on it, implicit.harvard.edu. If you want to create an account, you can go back and take the same IAT and see if you've been able to shift your preference, as well as you can keep track of your scores for the different types of IATs. And then outsmartinghumanminds.org is a site that has like videos, very easy access resources on a variety of topics. And at the bottom, it says surround yourself with anti-normative content. So that is a big way that researchers say you can try to reduce your implicit bias, which is what we're focused on today. And so anti-normative content is just anything that goes against the grain. The person who wrote the book and was presenting to me said that he put his screensaver, oh, not that one, with this picture of Prince Harry and an apron. Like, he put that as like a screensaver on his computer because it's a man wearing an apron in the kitchen and cooking. So he had a better picture. I could not find the one that he used, but he had one with Harry like holding a wisp or something. But here's my slide on anti-normative content. And these all came from a website called Love Has No Labels. So that's what this slide is from. And they have stories about folks that have shared their story. And they have a bunch of resources. This is just a screenshot of one thing under the resources tab called Be a Better Ally. And then there's even more, I'm like pointing to my computer if y'all can see it, but there's even more boxes besides these 2 that show Guide to Pride and Challenging Biased Language. And so some of these pictures that I grabbed would be considered anti-normative content because it's not just the mainstream type of images that we are bombarded with all the time. And something I've recently done is on Instagram, I went hunting for accounts that would just add anti-normative content to my feed. So I found a couple of LGBTQ+ accounts. I found one that's like Black Gay Weddings, I think is what it was called. And so sometimes they like pop up on my feed. I'm like, I don't know this person. And I'm like, oh yeah, that I'm not supposed to. But it's been really fun for me the last couple of weeks to kind of see that that content in that way. So if you surround yourself with anti-normative content, it could help reduce your level of implicit bias. And it's not just race. Like I put a picture up here with the referencing disability. There's, you know, sexuality, sexual orientation, religion, all types of stuff. Just, you know, instead of having pictures of people that always look like you, try to find ways to sneak these other things in, and that would be the anti-normative content. I'm just going to post the takeaways. You can read if you want, but then if there's any more comments or if folks want to say one last thing out loud, feel free.